Welcome back. So we've just spent the last couple of weeks looking at the pillars of a free market, what kind of characteristics an economy might have in order to be classified as a free market capitalist economy. But now we want to ask a really important question, and that is, how did we get a free enterprise system? So we're going to take a really expansive look at economic history in a very short period of time here. But we really want to know one thing, and that is that capitalism and markets as we see them today in the United States is a relatively new phenomenon in human history. So let's get started. Before markets as we know them, nations had followed an economic system that was called mercantilism. And mercantilism was interesting in that its entire goal was for a nation to maximize its wealth. It had to also maximize the amount of stuff that it sold to other countries, while at the same time limiting the amount of stuff it imported from other countries. Why was this important? Well, it all has to do with how the mercantilists viewed wealth. And it's a very different view of wealth than the capitalists have later on. To a mercantilist, wealth was not defined as the value of goods and services. Wealth was not subjective in the way that we talked about it before. To the mercantilist, wealth was defined strictly as the amount of precious metals, gold in particular, that a country had in its reserves. And so now we can start asking, well, what was it that allowed a country then to maximize its wealth? And here's where we can start to see these two ideas come together. But it's important to pause and note that to the mercantilists, because wealth was defined as gold and silver, as a precious metal, there's really only so much of that in a real sense in the world. And so to the mercantilist, wealth could not be created. It could only be transferred. And to the mercantilist, there was one way to transfer wealth positively and one way to transfer it negatively. And that all has to do with trade. So if you have this view of wealth as being fixed, then you know that trades, voluntary as they may be, don't result in a mutually beneficial outcome like we talked about before. If I trade you a quarter and you trade me a cup of coffee, then that's mutually beneficial because I valued the coffee more than the quarter and you valued the quarter more than the coffee. But if wealth is fixed and I make a trade, then somebody has to lose and somebody has to win. And under mercantilism, the way you win is to export as much stuff as you can. Because when you export, the only way that a country can import the good is by giving you gold. So to export something means that you bring gold into your country. That's what you accept as payment for the goods and services that you're producing. Now, let's say that you need to import something that you can't do at home in order to build or manufacture something. Well, then you have to pay for that import using gold, and gold goes out of your country. And to the mercantilists, he who, or the country who, exports the most gold is the country who has the upper hand. Remember, we're transferring, it's not mutually beneficial. So in order to do this, right, there tends to be a balance between what we import and export if we let the market just follow its natural course. But of course, the mercantilists are not interested in that. And mercantilism requires a large and expansive government to regulate trade and to promote protectionism, to protect domestic industries. Think about this, guys, so that they can produce as much as they can at home so they don't have to depend on importing, thus getting rid of gold from other countries. The more we can build at home and manufacture and ship to other countries as exports, the more gold our nation can bring in. So another way to think about this is to think about money in general. And we had just in the previous section talked about money. So I want you to think now, if I revise this to the 21st century to show you why mercantilism was more or less a flawed system and why the fixed wealth theory, though flawed as it may be, is still really pervasive in thought today. So if we take out gold as a source of money and we use now dollar bills to replace that, we can see that even though we don't agree that gold is the source of wealth, we very much, and I think wrongfully so, agree that mercantilist ideas, this idea that trade is a win-lose, is still prevalent. So here's what most people think. Most people think that when there are two trading partners, say Steve Jobs and somebody who wants an iPhone, what we tend to see is the transfer of money between the buyer of the iPhone and the producer or the seller of the iPhone. And when this happens, what we tend to think, our impulse is to say that, the buyer is $300 worse off on account that, well, she now has $300 less in her pocket or her bank account. And we tend to see Steve Jobs or the manufacturer or the seller or the producer as $300 richer now because, well, they've got the $300 in some form or fashion. We tend to see this very visibly, but what we fail to see, I think maybe just fail to recognize, is that there's another entire half in a free market to this transaction. So in real life, it's not that the buyer is automatically $300 worse off on the whole and the seller is $300 better off on the whole. What happens is that we have to balance this out against what is being received from the buyer. Remember, the buyer gives up their $300, but in exchange for that, they get a product, a new product, an iPhone, for instance. And Steve Jobs, right, even though he gets the $300, he has to give something up in the trade as well, and he has to give up the phone. So now we've got enough information to really balance out and see the benefits or costs of trade. So Steve Jobs, worse off by a phone, sad face, and the buyer is better off by the phone. So what does this trade tell us? I know this seems awfully elementary, but let's bring it back to what we're actually talking about. At the very top, what this means, if the woman was willing to buy the phone, then that means that she valued the phone more than she valued the $300. And what this means for Steve Jobs or Apple is that they valued the $300 more than they valued the phone. And so in this case, both parties are actually better off. The woman is better off, the buyer is better off because she valued what she got more than what she gave up. And the producer obviously is better off because he valued what he gave up less than what he gained.